Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a very nice break. So let's continue by looking at some few application questions, referring to of course, the macro environment's meaning and components. So our first application question is then a scenario. The introduction reads, read the following scenario and answer the questions that follow. So this is about Lily and Daisy Importers, or LDI. Lily and Daisy import products for big retailers as well as wealthy individuals, or individual clients rather. They recently did an environmental analysis. They discovered that the following factors have a big influence on their business. The rand has weakened and the exchange rate is very expensive. There has been changes in importation laws which increased admin costs. Now question A asks, identify the relevant business environment affecting LDI from the given scenario. Now when we look at the scenario, the first few lines is only an introduction to what is happening, or the information that the questioner wants to give us rather. Okay, so the first bullet states that the rand has weakened and the exchange rate is expensive. So this can be seen as an economical environmental factor. And then our second bullet says there has been changes in importation laws. So laws can be seen as our legal environmental factors. And of course, economical and legal are a part of our macro environment. So it's only necessary to answer the business environment. If you can see in the question, it says identify the relevant business environment. So our answer will then be straightforward, macro environment. But then the question continues and it asks, identify two components of the environment identified in question 1A, of course the macro environment, from the given scenario, and then motivate your answer by providing a quote from the scenario. So the question actually asks, we must now identify two components of the macro environment given in the scenario. Now again, if I refer you to those two bullets at the bottom, the first one refers to the exchange rate, which is an example of our economical environment. So our first component will then be our economic environment. Sorry, I'm going to fix this mistake there. Economic environment. And then remember, when we have to quote the whole sentence as is word from the scenario. So our motivation will be then that whole bullet that we have given as a quote. Our second component then is the following bullet, which refers to laws. And remember, laws is usually our legal environment. So our answer then here will be our legal environment. Let me just look at my spelling. I'm struggling a bit today. Legal environment. And then again, our quote will be our motivation. So the whole bullet must be quoted in our motivation. There have been changes in importation laws which increased admin costs. So there we have identified the two macro environment components from the given scenario, plus we have motivated by quoting from the scenario. So that's our first application question. Let's go take a look at our second one. The second question states, identify the components of the macro environment. So there's our clues, which environment we are busy working with, described by the following statements. So the first statement, A, John's factory is struggling to continue production as there is a shortage in raw materials. So there it is. That is the clue in this statement. Raw materials, and of course raw materials are gained or produced in the natural environment And the natural environment is then, of course, part of our environmental environment. So our answer here will be environmental environment. Right, so that is our first component. Let's take a look at statement B. Mary has installed new software systems, there's our clue in the statement, in her business, computers. I think this is a quite straightforward one because software and computers are, of course, examples of technology. So our answer here will be technological environment. Okay, so that is our component for statement B, which is then our technological environment. Statement C. Due to the war in the Ukraine, PP Petrol has struggled to import oil needed for petrol production. So this is, of course, something that is happening outside of the borders of South Africa, which can then be seen as an international environmental issue, which we then classify. Remember, natural and international is part then of our environmental component. So we say the answer then is our environmental environment. All right, so let's take a look at our last statement. Because of the adjustment to the tax law, there's our first clue, businesses now have to pay 15% VAT. So our clue is the word law, and laws, of course, refer to legal. So our answer here will be legal environment. Right, so now we have identified the component that suits each statement. Okay, our last question then for application questions is again a scenario. Read the scenario below and answer the questions, or the question rather, that follows. Eddie and Tony own a training company. Recently, they had to increase their prices because of the high inflation rate in South Africa. Although their expenses have increased, they are still determined to give back to the community by investing in skills development of the unemployed. Now, what is the question? The question, discuss the two components. There's a first thing, the two components. So what must we do? We must discuss them. So we must describe in full sentences the two components of the macro environment. All right, addressed in the scenario. So when we think of the components, we think of political, economical, of course, social, technological, legal, and environmental. So when we look back at the scenario, the first sentence, Eddie and Tony own a training company. Then the sentence says, recently they had to increase their prices because of the high inflation rate in South Africa. So our clue here is inflation rate. So our first component then will be economic environment. So now we have to discuss the economic environment. This is kind of a higher order question, a bit of a more difficult question. So the answer will be economic environment, and we will continue by discussing this environment. So we will say that it refers to all the factors that influence buying habits of consumers, and it consists of external factors in the immediate marketplace and, of course, our broader economy. So that is then our first discussion, or rather the discussion of our first component. Then when we continue to look at this scenario, we will then see it continues by stating, although their expenses have increased, they are still determined to give back to the community by investing in skills development of the unemployed. So unemployment is, of course, a socio-economic issue, and Tony and Eddie are, of course, addressing this issue, which can then be seen as a social environmental component. So then our second component will then be social environment. But remember the question asks, discuss. So we will then discuss the social environment by giving the bullets. It refers to the immediate physical and social setting in which people live. Then of course remember social environment includes cultural environment. That will be things like their religion or traditions and customs, and the demographic environment, which will be the socioeconomic characteristics of a population. So there we have it. We have identified the two components and we have discussed it in full sentences. So this is kind of a tricky one. I hope I helped you to answer something like this, if you can find it in a question paper, for example. But before we wrap up, let's just take a short break.